Unexplained footage from the USS Indianapolis has scientists completely stunned. In August 2017, a camera 3.5 miles beneath the Pacific Ocean recorded something that made no sense. A research vessel funded by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen had been scanning 600 square miles of open water, searching for a ship the United States Navy had been unable to find for 72 years. When the remotely operated vehicle finally reached the ocean floor, 18,000 feet below the surface, it captured footage that sent shockwaves through the naval history community. The paint was still intact. Supply boxes still read Indianapolis in legible letters. The anchor still bore the name Norfolk as clearly as the day it was forged. A warship that had been sitting at the bottom of the Philippine Sea since 1945 looked as though it had sunk yesterday. But the most disturbing detail was not the preservation. It was what the footage revealed about how the ship actually went down. Because what the cameras found did not match the official story the Navy had been telling for over 7 decades. This is the USS Indianapolis, a 610-foot Portland-class heavy cruiser that served as the flagship of the United States Fifth Fleet during World War II. Launched in 1931 and commissioned the following year, the Indianapolis had been one of the most storied vessels in the American fleet. She had been President Franklin Roosevelt's ship of state, carrying him on diplomatic voyages to South America and to the Naval Academy. She had survived the attack on Pearl Harbor, fought in nearly every major Pacific campaign from the Aleutian Islands to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, and had been struck by a kamikaze just 4 months before her final voyage, an attack her crew fought off and repaired through sheer determination. The Indianapolis had earned 10 battle stars. Her crew had seen more combat than most sailors would see in a lifetime. And its story contains the most classified naval mission in American history. The worst shark attack ever recorded, a government cover-up that destroyed an innocent man, and a discovery on the ocean floor that finally exposed the truth. To understand what that camera found in 2017, you need to understand what really happened on the night of July 30th, 1945. And that begins with a secret so dangerous that even the ship's own captain was not allowed to know what he was carrying. In the early morning hours of July 16, 1945, a 15-foot wooden crate and 2 small lead-lined containers were loaded onto the USS Indianapolis at the Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco. The operation was carried out under armed guard by men who spoke in code and showed credentials that made senior officers step aside without asking questions. The crate weighed several hundred pounds. The 2 black containers were only 18 inches square, but weighed over 200 pounds each. They were welded to the deck of the captain's cabin. Armed Marines were assigned to guard them around the clock, with orders to shoot anyone who approached without authorization. Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III, a decorated officer from a distinguished Navy family whose father had once commanded the Navy's Asiatic Fleet, was told nothing about the contents. He was told only one thing: every hour he shaved off the voyage would shorten the war. McVeigh took that order seriously. Just hours before the Indianapolis departed, the first successful atomic detonation had been conducted at the Trinity test site in New Mexico. The world had entered the nuclear age, and the Indianapolis was about to carry its first weapon across the Pacific. The ship made the 5,000-mile journey from San Francisco to the island of Tinian in just 10 days, a speed record that still stands for a vessel of that class. The crew had no idea they were transporting the enriched uranium-235 and the firing mechanism for Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima 3 weeks later. Seaman Harold Bray, just 17 years old and fresh out of boot camp, later recalled sitting on top of the wooden crate during the voyage, using it as a bench. He had no idea he was perched on the instrument of roughly 100,000 deaths. In fact, the secrecy was so complete that even the ship's executive officer was never told the nature of the cargo. The crew invented theories among themselves. Some guessed it was gold, others thought it was toilet paper for General MacArthur. Nobody came close to the truth. On July 26th, the Indianapolis delivered its cargo to Tinian Island. The mission was complete. The most important delivery in the history of warfare had been executed flawlessly. What happened next should have been routine, but it became the worst naval disaster in American history. and the chain of catastrophic failures that caused it started before the ship even left port. After dropping off its secret cargo, the Indianapolis sailed to Guam, where some crew members who had completed their tours of duty were rotated out and fresh replacements came aboard. Many of these new arrivals were teenagers who had never been to sea in a combat zone. On July 28th, McVeigh received orders to proceed to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines for gunnery training before joining the forces preparing for the planned invasion of Japan. He requested a destroyer escort for the voyage. Standard protocol for a heavy cruiser traveling through waters where Japanese submarines had been active would have included at least one escort vessel with sonar capability. The request was denied. McVeigh was told the route was safe and the risk of submarine attack was negligible. The routing officer at Guam assessed the threat level as low, even though just days earlier, a destroyer escort, the USS Underhill, had been sunk by a Japanese submarine along a nearby route. What McVeigh was not told, and what would later become the most damning revelation of the entire disaster, was that American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese communications indicating that submarine IB-58 was operating directly along his planned route. That intelligence was classified under the Ultra program, the same code-breaking operation that had helped win the war in Europe. The Navy knew the danger. Officers at the routing headquarters had access to this intelligence, and they said nothing. The Indianapolis was also not equipped with sonar, the basic technology that would have allowed it to detect an approaching submarine. General Leslie Groves, who oversaw the Manhattan Project, would later call the Indianapolis a very poor choice to carry the bomb, noting it had no underwater sound equipment and was so poorly designed that a single torpedo could sink it quickly. But by the time anyone realized the magnitude of these compounding failures, it was already too late. Just after midnight on July 30th, 1945, the Indianapolis was steaming through the Philippine Sea at 17 knots, alone and unescorted, halfway between Guam and Leyte Gulf. Below the surface, Japanese submarine IE-58, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, had been tracking the ship's silhouette against the moonlit horizon. Hashimoto initially thought he had spotted a battleship. He ordered 6 Type 95 torpedoes loaded into their tubes. At 12:15 in the morning, 2 of those torpedoes slammed into the starboard side of the Indianapolis. The first tore off the entire bow of the ship. The second struck near midships, detonating the fuel tanks and powder magazines. A pillar of fire erupted into the night sky. The explosion ripped the ship nearly in half. The Indianapolis was still traveling at 17 knots with no bow. Seawater poured into the forward compartments at a catastrophic rate. Captain McVeigh was thrown from his bunk by the blast. He scrambled to the bridge and ordered a distress signal sent, but the first radio room was destroyed. He ran to the second radio room where an operator tapped out an SOS on a brass key. The operator saw the transmission meter move and believed the signal went out. McVeigh's executive officer reported to the bridge. The ship was listing severely. Forward compartments were flooding beyond any hope of damage control. McVeigh gave the order to abandon ship. But with all electrical power gone, the order could only be passed by word of mouth. In the chaos and darkness, with flames and smoke and fuel oil coating every surface, not every sailor heard it. The Indianapolis rolled onto its side. Men climbed over the railing and walked down the hull before stepping into the black water. The propellers rose into the air. 12 minutes after the first torpedo struck, the USS Indianapolis disappeared beneath the waves. She took nearly 300 men with her. Roughly 890 souls remained on the surface, floating in the warm black water of the Philippine Sea, covered in fuel oil, many of them injured, most of them without lifeboats. They assumed rescue would come within hours. They had no way of knowing that nobody was coming. Not for a very long time. Here is where the story becomes almost impossible to believe. The Indianapolis's distress signal was received by 3 separate Navy shore stations. 3 different posts, staffed by trained communications personnel, heard the SOS of a sinking heavy cruiser with nearly 1,200 men aboard. Not one of them responded. Not one of them dispatched a rescue ship. Not one of them even logged the signal for follow-up. Declassified records later revealed the reasons, and they are staggering in their negligence. At one station, the commanding officer was drunk. At another, the commanding officer had left standing orders not to be disturbed under any circumstances. At the third, the officer on duty dismissed the signal as a Japanese trick designed to lure American ships into a trap. 3 chances to save hundreds of lives. 3 failures born of incompetence, arrogance, and indifference. But it gets worse. When the Indianapolis failed to arrive at Leyte Gulf on July 31st as scheduled, nobody reported the ship missing. The port director at Leyte and his operations officer were later found to have not tracked the ship's expected arrival because of what the Navy would officially describe as a misunderstanding of the movement report system. It was common for ships to be rerouted during wartime, and since the Indianapolis had been the flagship of Admiral Spruance, officers assumed the ship had simply been diverted to another assignment. Nobody checked. Nobody asked. A 610-foot heavy cruiser with nearly 1,200 men aboard had simply vanished from the United States Navy's awareness. Meanwhile, in the middle of the Philippine Sea, hell had arrived. As dawn broke on July 30th, the survivors of the Indianapolis found themselves scattered across miles of open ocean. Some clung to life rafts, some floated on cargo nets held up by cork. Many had nothing but their Kapok life vests, which would slowly become waterlogged over the coming days. The water was warm, about 85 degrees, but that only accelerated dehydration under the brutal tropical sun. There was almost no fresh water, almost no food. A few men found floating rations of Spam and crackers among the wreckage, but opening a can of Spam in the water could trigger what came next. The sharks arrived with the first morning light. Oceanic white-tip sharks, among the most aggressive open water predators on Earth, were drawn by the vibrations of the sinking, the spreading oil slick, and the smell of blood from hundreds of wounded men. At first, they fed on the dead. The bodies of those killed by the torpedoes or drowned during the sinking floated among the living, and the sharks circled beneath them, pulling corpses under one by one. Then they turned to the wounded. Survivor Lowell Dean Cox later described the attacks to the BBC. He said the sharks were continually there, mostly feeding off the dead bodies. They were losing 3 or 4 men each night and day. You could see their fins, 12 to 24 of them, circling constantly. Then, like lightning, one would come straight up and take a sailor straight down. One came up and took the sailor right next to Cox, just somebody screaming, yelling, or getting bit. The survivors learned quickly that their best chance was in a group, and in the center of that group. Men on the edges or drifting alone were the most vulnerable. They kicked at the sharks, they splashed, they huddled together and waited, but the waiting was its own kind of torture. By the second day, dehydration was setting in. The sun was relentless. Men's lips cracked and swelled, their tongues thickened. Some began hallucinating. They saw islands on the horizon. They swore the ship was just below the surface and that they could swim down to it for fresh water. Some men hallucinated that Japanese sailors were offering them drinks. Survivor Tony King, decades later at age 94, still recalled how men around him lost their minds. Promises of pretty girls carrying fresh buttermilk biscuits or a cold drink just over the horizon, he said. Those were the visions of dying men. The most dangerous hallucination was the most common. Men became convinced they could see freshwater springs just below the surface. They ducked their heads under and drank the salt water. Saltwater poisoning is a death sentence. Within hours, the sodium concentration in their blood would spike. Their kidneys would begin to shut down. Their eyes would glaze over. They would slip into violent delirium, foaming at the mouth as their tongues and lips swelled to grotesque proportions. Many of these men then turned on their shipmates, dragging others beneath the surface as they died. Some pulled knives, others attacked the men holding them up, convinced they were Japanese soldiers. The living became as dangerous as the sharks. Bosunin's mate Eugene Morgan recalled the relentlessness of the attacks. All the time, the sharks never let up, he said. We had a cargo net with styrofoam floats. There were about 15 sailors holding on. Suddenly, 10 sharks hit it, and there was nothing left. This went on and on and on. Another survivor, fireman First Class George Horvath, described breaking away from his group to reach a survival craft that had been dropped from a plane during an earlier flyover. He was swimming alone when he glanced down into the clear water. A shark was staring back at him. "Not now, Lord," he whispered. "Not now." He survived. Many who drifted away from the group did not. The nights were in some ways worse than the days. The temperature dropped, hypothermia set in for men already weakened by dehydration and blood loss. Men who had clung to life all day would quietly slip beneath the surface in the darkness. By morning, the group would be smaller. The remaining men would collect the life vests of the dead and redistribute them to those whose vests were waterlogged. There was no ceremony. There was no time. Survivor Edgar Harrell, a 19-year-old Marine corporal, later summed up the ordeal with devastating simplicity. "You have to fight to live," he said, "but all you have to do to die is just give up, and I saw many young men do that." Dick Thielen, who was just 18 years old, would later tell NPR that he did not speak about the experience for decades. Years ago, he said, "I would not be talking about it to you or anybody else. I would not talk about it for years." By the morning of August 2nd, the fourth day in the water, the dead outnumbered the living. Hundreds of bodies drifted among the survivors, attended by sharks that never left. The men who remained alive had gone over 90 hours without significant food or fresh water in 100-degree heat surrounded by predators. Then, at 11 in the morning, something happened that defied probability. Navy Lieutenant Junior Grade Wilbur Chuck Gwynn was flying a PV-1 Ventura patrol bomber on a routine sector search over the Philippine Sea. He was not looking for survivors. He had no reports of any distressed American vessel in the area. He was in the belly of the plane, trying to fix a loose antenna wire, when he happened to glance out and down. Below him, stretching for miles across the surface of the ocean, was a long slick of fuel oil. Gwynn assumed it was from a Japanese submarine. His crew prepared to drop depth charges, but as the Ventura descended to 300 feet for the attack run, they saw something that stopped them cold. Irregular bumps on the surface, dozens of them, then hundreds. Men. Oil-covered, sun-blistered men, waving and splashing. Gwynn immediately radioed for help. Within hours, Lieutenant Adrian Marks arrived in a PBY-5A Catalina flying boat with rafts and supplies. When he descended low enough to see what was happening below, the scene was almost incomprehensible. Clusters of oil-blackened men bobbing in the waves, lone figures drifting apart from the groups, and circling among them the unmistakable dorsal fins of dozens of sharks. As Marks watched, he saw a shark attack a man in the water in real time. He made a decision that would define his legacy. He disobeyed direct orders and landed the flying boat in the open ocean, in the middle of shark-infested waters. The landing itself was incredibly dangerous. Open ocean swells could easily flip a seaplane or shear off its pontoons, but Marks brought it down and immediately began taxiing toward the most vulnerable stragglers, the men drifting alone at the edges who were being picked off one by one. He pulled survivors out of the water and lashed them to the wings of the plane with parachute cord. By nightfall, the Catalina had so many men strapped to its wings that it could never fly again. Marks had sacrificed his aircraft to save 56 men. Shortly after midnight on August 3rd, the destroyer USS Cecil Doyle arrived and trained its searchlight straight into the sky like a beacon, signaling to the survivors that help had finally come. Rescue ships worked through the night, pulling men from the water. Of the roughly 890 men who had entered the Philippine Sea 4 days earlier, only 316 were still alive. The sinking of the USS Indianapolis remains the single greatest loss of life at sea from a single ship in United States Navy history. Those shark attacks that followed are considered the deadliest mass shark attack on humans ever recorded. Survivor Dick Thielen later said something haunting about the rescue. He said if Chuck Gwynn had looked any other direction or flown any other route, he would not have seen us. None of us would have survived. But the nightmare did not end with the rescue. It was about to be compounded by something arguably worse: injustice. In November 1945, Captain Charles McVeigh was charged with 2 counts: failure to order abandoned ship in a timely manner and hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag to evade submarine attack. He was acquitted on the first charge, but he was convicted on the second, despite the fact that his orders from the Navy specifically stated he should zigzag at his discretion, weather permitting, despite the fact that the Navy had failed to warn him about the Japanese submarine operating along his route, despite the fact that the Navy had denied him a destroyer escort, despite the fact that the Navy's own intelligence failures and communication breakdowns had left his ship exposed and then abandoned his crew in the open ocean for 4 days, and despite perhaps the most extraordinary piece of testimony in the entire trial. Commander Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine captain who had sunk the Indianapolis, was brought to Washington to testify. He stated plainly that zigzagging would have made no difference. He would have hit the Indianapolis regardless. It did not matter. McVeigh was convicted. He became the only captain in the history of the United States Navy to be court-martialed for losing a ship to enemy action. Not a single one of the 700 captains who lost ships during World War II was court-martialed. Only McVeigh. His career was effectively over. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who privately told Indianapolis survivors that the court-martial was a mistake, remitted the sentence. McVeigh was eventually promoted to Rear Admiral upon retirement in 1949. But the damage was done. Paul Murphy, president of the USS Indianapolis Survivors Organization, would later describe what really happened in plain language. Captain McVeigh's court-martial was simply to divert attention from the terrible loss of life caused by procedural mistakes which never alerted anyone that we were missing. Many of the families of the men who had died blamed McVeigh personally. They sent him letters, Christmas cards. One read, "Merry Christmas. Our family's holiday would be a lot merrier if you had not killed my son." Year after year, the letters came. Some of his own crew defended him publicly, insisting the Navy was using their captain as a shield. But the voices of grieving parents were louder. McVeigh carried the weight of 879 dead men on his shoulders, a burden the Navy had placed there to deflect attention from its own catastrophic failures. Commander Hashimoto, the man who had sunk the Indianapolis, eventually wrote a letter to Senator John Warner in 1999. In it, he said something remarkable. "Our peoples have forgiven each other for that terrible war. Perhaps it is time your people forgave Captain McVeigh for the humiliation of his unjust conviction." The man who fired the torpedoes was asking America to show mercy to the man who took the blame. On November 6, 1968, 23 years after the sinking, Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III walked out of his home in Litchfield, Connecticut. He was 70 years old. His wife had died of cancer 7 years earlier. The letters from grieving families had never stopped. He took his own life. Many of his surviving crew members had insisted for decades that McVeigh was not to blame. They called the court-martial what it was, a cover-up. The Navy needed a scapegoat, and McVeigh was the only target that would make the Navy's own failures disappear from the headlines. The fight to clear McVeigh's name would take another 32 years. It would begin with the most unlikely champion imaginable. In 1996, a 12-year-old boy in Pensacola, Florida, named Hunter Scott, watched the movie Jaws. In the film, the character Quint, played by Robert Shaw, delivers a haunting monologue about surviving the sinking of the Indianapolis. That scene became one of the most powerful in cinema history, and it brought the Indianapolis story to millions who had never heard of it. Scott was captivated. He chose the Indianapolis for a school project and threw himself into the research. He interviewed nearly 150 survivors. He poured through 800 official Navy documents. What he found proved conclusively that McVeigh had been denied critical intelligence about the submarine threat, denied a destroyer escort despite requesting one, and convicted on evidence that the Japanese submarine commander himself said was irrelevant. Scott testified before the United States Senate Armed Services Committee. A 12-year-old boy stood before the United States Senate and presented the evidence that the Navy had buried for half a century. On October 30th, 2000, President Bill Clinton signed a resolution declaring that the court-martial charges against Captain McVeigh were not morally sustainable. The resolution said his conviction was a miscarriage of justice and that the American people should recognize his lack of culpability. In July 2001, Secretary of the Navy Gordon England ordered McVeigh's official record cleared of any mention of wrongdoing. Hunter Scott, the boy who started a school project because of a movie, later grew up to become a naval aviator. Justice had arrived, but it came 32 years too late for the man who needed it most. Then came the footage. For 72 years, the exact location of the Indianapolis was unknown. Several expeditions had tried and failed to find the wreck. The Navy's own position estimate turned out to be 40 miles off from the actual sinking location. The ocean floor in the search area was a maze of underwater mountains and canyons at depths exceeding 3 miles. Finding a 600-foot ship down there was like searching for a needle in a haystack the size of a small state. In 2016, Navy historian Richard Holver made a breakthrough. He discovered a log entry from a tank landing ship, LST-779, that recorded passing the Indianapolis 11 hours before the torpedo struck. This data, combined with existing records, revealed that the ship had been moving faster and was farther west than anyone had previously assumed. The new search area was narrowed from 3,000 square miles to 600. Paul Allen, co-founder of Microsoft and the son of a World War II veteran, deployed his 250-foot research vessel, the RV Petrel, equipped with remotely operated vehicles capable of diving to 6,000 meters. On August 19, 2017, the cameras found her. The USS Indianapolis lay at the bottom of the Philippine Sea in an enormous impact crater, her hull resting among the rocky mountain ranges of the deep ocean floor. The main body of the wreck was remarkably, almost impossibly, well preserved. 18,000 feet below the surface, in near freezing water with almost no oxygen and no natural light, the ship had been shielded from the currents, marine growth, and corrosion that destroy most wrecks within decades. Robert Nayland, the Navy's head of underwater archaeology, described the discovery with undisguised astonishment. "The paint is still in place," he said. "On the anchor you can read Norfolk. On supply boxes you can read Indianapolis. Clear as the day they were stamped." He compared the conditions to the dark side of the moon. No light reaches these depths. No diver can survive there. The wreck had existed in a kind of suspended animation, a time capsule from 1945, sealed by 3.5 miles of black water. The ROV cameras methodically documented every section of the wreckage. They captured the ship's main battery guns, her anti-aircraft weapons, and the distinctive hull markings that confirmed the ship's identity. The number 35, the Indianapolis's hull designation, was clearly visible on the wreckage, providing the first definitive confirmation. But the footage also revealed something that challenged 7 decades of official narrative. The bow of the ship, torn off by the first torpedo, lay 1.5 miles east of the main wreck. The 2 forward gun turrets, which had broken away on the surface, lay 1/2 mile east. The bridge had separated entirely and rested in a debris field near the forward guns. The Navy's Bureau of Ships had written its official damage report in 1945, based solely on survivor interviews, because there was no wreckage to examine. Now, for the first time, naval archaeologists could compare that report against the physical evidence. The footage showed that the damage was far more catastrophic than the official record described. The impact crater, the separation pattern of the hull sections, the distribution of debris across the ocean floor, all of it told the story of a ship that never had a chance. The second torpedo had effectively split the Indianapolis to the keel. No amount of zigzagging, no damage control procedure, no decision by any captain could have saved her. The footage from the deep did not just find the Indianapolis, it vindicated Charles McVeigh from the grave. In 2018, the crew of the USS Indianapolis was collectively awarded the Gold Medal, the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. At the ceremony, retired Navy Captain William Tody, who had championed the survivors' cause for decades, said something that still resonates. The survivors struggled for almost 5 days in the water just to survive. Then, for the next 5 decades, they continued to fight. They did not fight for recognition for themselves. They did not fight for restitution from the Navy for the awful fact that they were forgotten in the water and left to die. They fought to clear their captain's name. Today, only one survivor of the USS Indianapolis remains alive. Harold Bray, the 17-year-old who once sat unknowingly on top of a nuclear weapon, is now 98 years old. In 2024, his hometown of Benicia, California, erected a life-size bronze statue of him as a young sailor. He accepted the honor with quiet humility. The USS Indianapolis rests 3.5 miles beneath the Philippine Sea. Her exact coordinates remain classified by the United States Navy. The site is legally protected as a war grave, the final resting place of nearly 300 sailors who went down with their ship in 12 minutes on a warm Pacific night in 1945. Above them, the ocean surface reveals nothing. No marker, no monument, just the endless roll of waves where 879 men fought and died across 4 days of unimaginable horror, forgotten by the very Navy they served. For the families of the lost, the discovery provided something they had waited 7 decades for. As retired Captain Toady said, it gave them a point on the map they could point to and say, "This is where my father, uncle, brother lies. This is hallowed ground for us." The Indianapolis did not sink because of one man's mistake. It sank because of a system that classified critical intelligence, denied a warship basic protection, ignored 3 distress signals, failed to notice when a flagship disappeared, and then court-martialed the one man who tried to save his crew. Every safeguard that should have protected those 1,200 men was either absent, broken, or deliberately withheld. And when the system failed, the system found a scapegoat instead of a mirror. It took a camera 18,000 feet beneath the ocean, 72 years of silence, a 12-year-old boy's school project, and a billionaire's private research vessel to finally tell the truth. The footage from the bottom of the Philippine Sea did not just find a shipwreck. It found the evidence that history had tried to bury. And if you think about what that means, about how long it can take for the truth to surface when powerful institutions have reason to bury it, that might be the most unsettling part of this entire story. If you found this fascinating, hit subscribe for more stories like this.